right, let's open this meeting with a moment of silence, followed by the serenity prayer, please. God, grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to live with yours. Amen. All right. Who all's having a good time so far? All right. So if y'all don't know how the panel goes, the way that we do is I ask a question, and then I give each one of the panelists 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes to talk about the question, give their experience on it. After, just let y'all know when y'all get close to 10 minutes, I'll do this. Y'all see that over there? Okay. Yeah. And then that'll give 1 minute left. And then, and if we'll do 2 questions, and if there's time, we'll do a third. So, anyway, we got Mike from Nashville. We got Marion from way deep south, and then we got Tammy from Asheville, Spruce Pine, North Carolina. All right, and I'm really grateful for all 3 of them to come up here and do this. I forgot to tell you, the questions, they don't know the questions yet. Yeah, so I didn't want them to have premeditated lies, so if they lie, it's right on the spot. We'll see how good they are. So anyway, the first question, I think I'm going to go this one first. I don't even have to. I want to know. Each one of us have an Ebby. I want to hear about your Ebby and how Bill W. had Ebby brought the message to Bill W. I want to hear about an example of someone bringing the message to you. And we will start with you, Mike Allison.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Allison. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is February the 12th, 1990, and my home group's the Design for Living group in Nashville, Tennessee. We meet on Thursday nights at 7. Who was my Ebby? Wow, I don't know that there was one person, but there were 2 people in particular. I went to my first meeting. I went to a counselor, and they said that I need to go to AA and go to treatment, and I found out about this meeting. And I was scared and I was afraid. I was just broken. I was 39. I didn't know what else to do. I was running out of answers. And so I found out about this Friday night meeting, the Full Moon group in Nashville, or in Brentwood, actually. And I go over there and I pull in the parking lot. I don't know what to expect. I'm thinking AA is, a couple old guys in trench coats shaking and puking on each other. I didn't know what AA was. Parking lot's full of cars. People parked on the grass. I thought I've come on the wrong night. This church must be having some kind of picnic or bazaar, vacation Bible school or something. But I get out of my car and I start walking toward the building, and this guy starts walking over toward me, and he's this singer that I recognized. And immediately I'm thinking, what's this guy doing here? He's a cool guy. He's still a cool guy. And I'm thinking, this guy can't be in this A&A thing. He must belong to this church, or he's going to do a benefit for it or something. And this guy comes over to me, and he said, "Can I help you?" And I'm thinking, this guy's a cool guy. I said, I recognize you, man. You're so-and-so. And he said, yeah. And I introduced myself to him, and I said, I really love your voice and your band. I go see you guys at the Bluebird Cafe all the time. And the guy said, I appreciate that. But he said, can I help you? He just kept asking me that. And finally, I just said, I heard there was an AA meeting here. And this guy just lit up, and he said, you're in the right place, mate. And he opened the front door for me to my first meeting. And the fact that he was a guy that of course, I was hammered out of my mind every time I'd go see him perform. Here was a guy, I found out that he had 4 years of sobriety a little bit later, and he might as well have been Bill Wilson to me. Because I couldn't believe a guy like that could do rock and roll and be sober. So that was a real attraction for me. But the other man that was really my Ebby was the man that was my first sponsor. His name was Buff. He died in August of 2000. I think about him every day. Every day. I had to get a sponsor to get out of this treatment center I was in, this outpatient program, and so I thought, well, I'll get Buff to be my sponsor, because I thought he was president of AA, because he said good things in meetings, and everybody liked him, and he gave me his phone number the first time, and it actually worked a few days later, and I thought, I'll get Buff to be my sponsor, and I went to him and I said, Buff, I got to get a sponsor before I get out of treatment. And he just looked at me and he said, well, you ought to ask somebody, and walked off. And I went back to him and I said, Buff, will you be my sponsor? And he said, sure, I'll do that. He said, look, I don't know a lot about finance or romance. He said, I've been divorced twice. I've been bankrupt a couple times. He said, I don't know anything about that kind of stuff. He said, but I'm going to, if we're going to have this sponsorship thing, he said, I'm going to be bone-crushing honest with you, and I want you to be bone-crushing honest with me, or this deal's not going to work. And then he told me something that just changed my life. He said, if you'll take the 12 steps with me like I took them with my sponsor, your life will change whether you want it to or not. And to this day, I don't know if anybody's ever told me any better words than that. And he was a guy who really loused up his life, but this guy loved me back to health. And sometimes he told my later sponsor, Terry, that he was sponsoring at the time, he said, sometimes, he said, I have to have conversations with people, and turn them the right way sometimes. He said, sometimes I just have to dog cuss Michael to get his attention. But he loved me enough to do that. He loved me enough to hurt my feelings every time that he needed to do that. He was proactive with me. He asked me, he said, how are you and God? And I said, well, I think God made everything, and he just turned us loose. We just do what we do out here. And he said, well, I want you to get on your knees every day, every morning, and just ask God to direct your day. And at night, I want you to get on your knees and thank God for keeping you sober that day. I said, all right. A couple of days later, he said, well, how's that praying coming along? And I said, man, that stuff don't work for me. I don't do that. I'd run away from church years before. I was just a savage when I came into AA. And he just looked at me and he said, what do you got to lose, Hoss? And I didn't have a better idea. And honestly, I started getting on my knees every morning, every night, saying some kind of prayers that I didn't mean, just to get my sponsor off my back. But again, he was a man that loved me enough, that prevailed on me to do that. Later on, I got to a point where I was trying to live off the first 3 steps, just being wonderful and talking the talk and learning the lingo and going to meetings and not drinking. Has been talked about some about the other speakers this weekend about that won't work against alcoholism. And I'm trying to be just great on the outside, and inside I'm just falling apart, sober. And I'm afraid I'm going to drink. I'm afraid I'm going to take my life. And all of a sudden I had these overwhelming feelings come over me, like, I'd had my own business for years. It's the only thing I'd ever done. But deep down inside, I thought, if you ever knew who I really was, you wouldn't do business with me. I'm an idiot. I don't know how to do any part of this business. And I used to think I was some big God's gift to women at one time. And then I thought, I may be the worst person my wife's ever had near her. And all of a sudden, I had fallen apart as a failure, as a man, as a husband, as a father, as an employer. I just had this complete collapse on my own of trying to run my life. And I called Buff and I told him, I said, man, I just feel like a failure is everything. He said, well, go meet me at the Woodbine Club. So I leave my workplace and I drive straight to the Woodbine Club. Now, I thought he was coming right then, too. But he showed up about an hour and a half later. And I'm sitting there and I'm freaking out. I'm falling apart. And I remember him coming into the room and he walks up to me and he said, "You need some Valium, don't you?" And I thought, I've waited an hour and a half, for this man to come in and tell me that's what I need. And you know what? I thought, yeah, I do. I'm looking for some relief. I need some relief. And that's when he told me, he said, whatever God you think you have, your conception of God, he said, you need to fire that one. You need to find something you can lean on. And at that point in time, I didn't have a connection with God. I was going through the motions of saying the prayers, but most of the time I was saying, I don't believe this stuff, but I was getting comfortable doing those prayers, but I didn't have a faith and I didn't have a trust in God. And at that moment, I realized that there was all kinds of things I've been using for a higher power all my life. Whether it was my father, that he didn't want to be my higher power, and he didn't want me putting him on a pedestal, my business, my marriage, my bank account. If any of those things were going fine, then I thought everything's great. I can tell you I have a faith and trust in God, but just watch what I do. And that'll show you what I really put faith in. Whatever I put faith and trust in is what I'm leaning on. And if it's a person or a bank account or a new car or whatever the heck it is, sooner or later those things fall apart. And so through that process, I realized that all the worldly things that I'd been using were really my God. That was really my higher power. That was that other obscured by other things. And so I had to let go of all those things and realize that, hey, if there's not a higher power God out there, I'm in a lot of trouble. And so by Buff poking holes through my ego again and again, he led me to the solution. So he was really my Ebby, because I spent so many years walking in darkness. And in the worst of my alcoholism, that darkness just kept getting worse and worse to where I didn't have any other direction to go. But I know today, and I've just realized this a couple of years ago, I thought the grace of God entered my life when I got sober. No, man, the grace of God's always been there for me. I just couldn't see it. But I know there was a light pulling me all the time. I know now, looking back on it, there was this light. God's light was pulling me, saying, come on, man, you can do the right thing. I've got a good life for you. That was there all the time. Even when I was walking off in the worst of my alcoholism right before I got sober, when I was just walking into hell, that light was pulling me. The thing of it is, I've never been able to find that on my own. I've found it through the angels that God sent in Alcoholics Anonymous to help me. My sponsors, I have 3 sponsors. My first one died. My second one got Alzheimer's a couple of years ago, and now I have a sponsor named Jay who's just wonderful to recharge my battery. Those are the people that have carried the message to me. And particularly because Buff was my sponsor for 10 and a half years, he sat through and listened to my 5th step. He asked me what the worst thing on my 5th step was, and I told him. And instead of throwing me out of his house, he told me the worst thing is on his 5th step, because he loved me enough to share his deepest, darkest secrets to me, where I could empty this garbage can I was carrying around. And that man spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours helping me. I can never repay that, but I can pay it forward, because that's what he told me. He said, look, I'm going to pass this on to you, and I want you to pass it on to others. And if it wasn't for Buff, who was my Abby, I think I wouldn't do that. But I'm glad to be able to do that here today and to share this. Thank you. Thanks for letting me share.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary, and I'm alcoholic. My sobriety date is November 11th, 1989, and I'm just honored to be here with you all this weekend. And this whole not know the topic till we get up here. There's a prayer I work with that says, God, I trust in you. Take care of everything. And that was what I'm praying when I'm sitting there. And so I got sober in a little town north of Seattle, Bellingham, Washington. And I went through treatment and had just a little 30-day spin. And almost 2 years before I made it to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous of so many vain attempts at trying to control and enjoy my drinking, and knowing I was a wreck. I ended up going to the center, and it came behind the death of my son and the death of my mother. A year and a half later, I'm in AA. So, a year and a half, 2 years later, I'm in AA. So I came in with just grief. And I had this home group, two of my Ebbies. So there's two Ebbies. One's a old veteran named C.B. McLaren who had a flat top and suspenders and a flannel shirt and gave me my first job cleaning ashtrays. That made me feel a part of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was a joy and an incredible person in my life. He was the first person in AA to reach out his hand to me and say, "Hi, Marian, welcome." And it was the first time, and we say this all the time, the first time I ever felt a part of anything. And so I had these three little kids I'm trying to take care of at home. They're 7, 8, and 9 years old. I'm trying to get sober and going to Northwest and coming back and forth. And there's this little woman, we often in AA, we all have so many heroes that people will never know these people, that they're the world to us, right? And I remember I'd go to the noon meeting. The kids are in school, and I could go to the nooner, and then I could go home. And this little gal named Kathy Downs, she was like 4'11", but she was like a giant, And she came up to me after my nooner, and she said, "What are you doing this weekend, Marianne?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to take the kids here, and I'm going to clean the house, and I'm going to do the lawn." I'm giving her this whole rundown of all these things I'm going to do with my life over the weekend. And she looks at me, and I'm barely into the steps just from the treatment center. And she looks at me and she goes, "One of these days, maybe you'll slow down long enough for God to be in charge." And it just hit my heart. And I'm like, there's my girl. And the reason I came in on, bottoming out in alcoholism and this grief in my heart. And this woman, she had 3 little kids of her own. Her and her husband, Art, they were good AAs where they had the AA potlucks and the tea parties where there's actually no tea. It's actually coffee, cigarettes, and, people just, gossiping or whatever it is. And they were active role members in Alcoholics Anonymous, because oftentimes when I think of Ebby, I think of, he stood there fresh skin and glowing. Kathy stood there fresh skin and glowing. And early on in our recovery, she had what I wanted. She was being a mother to her children. She had what I wanted. She had this relationship with God. She had what I wanted. She was an active member of that fellowship, of that silly, goofy Northwest group of Alcoholics Anonymous, where, you were really a big booker if you went to Wednesday night big book study, and you were really in the program if you made it to Monday night for we used to call 12 by 12 meeting, And Kathy got me involved in that, and Kathy got me started on the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And very early on in that journey, Kathy was diagnosed with brain cancer. And I'm going to tell you, often so many times, the old timers in these programs, the people that, we can hear a sermon any day. We can hear a good talk from behind a podium. We can hear somebody sharing a meeting. We can hear all that. But she showed me. The questions were stuff like, "God, how do I get him to school? How do I do this? How do I do that?" And Kathy would show me by example. And I will be ever so forever grateful for that. And there were times, this is the stuff that her and her husband showed me. There was a time we couldn't pay our power bill, and there's no money in the bank. I'm talking to people at a meeting, and the next day, my red Jeep, I had the window down a little bit, and there's a money order on the front seat with a scribbled name on the bottom. I know who put that there. And there were times where she would call me. She's got cancer. She's going through chemo. She's losing her hair. And I don't want to call her. Like, Kathy's going through this stuff, and how do I call her? And she would call and just bee me out. I'll just say it that way. Who are you to deny me my sobriety by not calling me? And that's Alcoholics Anonymous to me. And she put another sponsor in place for me during the process of her death and when we buried her. But I got to bury my sponsor sober with grace and dignity. And I can tell you today, that relationship has never ended. Because here, 34 years sober, her son Art calls me Ma. And her daughter Liz calls me Ma. And my kids are as brother and sister to Art and to Liz any day. Because Kathy went first, and I believe Art died of a broken heart. They lived in a little trailer, and she would, sit down with me and work the book, and we were, she would just, it was just silly stuff, like just doing life stuff. Like, how do you even have fun in sobriety? And we were pressing leaves on wax paper and things like that. So that's my first Abby. That's it.
My name is Tammy, and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is December 10th, 1995, and my home group is a 12 and 12 study group in Asheville, North Carolina. Not that far from here, really. If you're ever in Western North Carolina on a Wednesday night at 6 p.m., come over to the 12 and 12 study group. Y'all want to guess what we do? Yes, we study the 12 and 12. Okay. It's such an interesting question. So I thought of a couple things, like, my first Ebby was the state of Texas, Judge Bradley Smith. Yeah. So when I came into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous at the ripe age of 23, I was not an alcoholic. I didn't belong here. But here's the problem. I had committed 4 alcohol-related felonies, and the state of Texas thought there might be a problem, right? And so I ended up in Judge Bradley Smith's court, and there was a whole lot of long sentencing, and one of the things that was part of that sentencing was to go to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I will tell you, I got sober initially through fear of going back to prison and consequences of what may happen if I drink, right? I love hindsight. When we look back, I love that because I look back and I say, had Judge Bradley Smith just been any old run-of-the-mill judge, the story may look different, right? But he wasn't. He was one of those judges that actually cared about people who came through his courtroom, and he cared about seeing them. I ended up back in his courtroom 6.5 years later to petition the court for something. I ended up back in front of him. He granted my wish, and he said, but you're going to do something for me. And he drugged me along through this journey, kicking and screaming at first. He started the first drug court program in Fort Bend County, Texas, back in the early 2000s. And he said, you're going to come along with me and you're going to help me. And at first I thought that was punishment, but when I look back, that was such a gift. There are so many things in my life that I can say when I look back, right? When I look back, if you had said, Tammy, do you want to be part of this drug court program? I would have said, good grief, no, I am busy, right? But when I look back, I think it is an experience I did not want to miss. So many beautiful things came out of that experience with this judge dragging me along, right? And one other Ebby I thought of was this woman who was my first sponsor. She started to write to me when I was locked up, and she would just give me little tidbits of her sobriety. And she wasn't the most active member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and she's not a member of Alcoholics Anonymous anymore. But she would write me letters and give me little tidbits. And she didn't sponsor me like I sponsor today. Back then, I didn't want to do anything, and she didn't make me do anything, so we got along famously, right? But eventually, I started to do a little something here, and I started to do a little something there, and we got to a 5th step. And what happened for me, sitting across the table from this woman and sharing my fifth step with her, things on there that, possibly, 95% of alcoholics had done that were horrendous to me, and sitting there and telling her about these felonies and telling her about these other things and having her look at me across the table, nod her head and say, I understand. Those words, 2 words, I understand, right? They were monumental for me, right? Because I thought nobody would ever understand, so many things about my life. And for her to sit across the table and do that, it just gave me that sudden feeling that I'm where I'm supposed to be, right? And I think the best gift that I can ever give back to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is to have the opportunity to sit across the table from another woman sharing her fifth step with me and saying, I understand, right? And it's just a miraculous thing. That's all I have. Thanks.
So just to let y'all know, Tammy, I asked her to be on the panel, and she says, I can't be, I'm busy. She says, I'm not coming, I've got other commitments. And then, so I got somebody else. The other person, right before this, said that they couldn't do it, that for medical reasons, whatnot. And then next thing you know, I go into the hospitality room, and there's Tammy. And then I said, hey, what are you doing? and then I said, she says, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was coming, all this. And I said, what, you still want to be on the panel? Because we just had a cancellation. She says, I'm not dressed. I said, it's okay. So she got put on the panel. Yeah. She didn't want to. All the stuff that we do in AA that we don't want to do, Ain't that right, Cliff? All right. The second question. The second question is, and you can word it any way you want to do in this, tell us about a second surrender since you've been sober. And we'll start with you again, Mike.
Wow. Thanks, Ben. Sort of. Second surrender since I got sober. Well, I've had a bunch of those. One I already described to you, where I thought I had a God in my life, and I really didn't, and I found a deeper understanding of it. That was another surrender. But I had one when I was about 9 or 10 years sober, and one day out of the blue, I was asking myself one of those self-centered questions that I'm always asking myself. I said, if somebody paid me a compliment, what would I most want to hear? I mean, what would I really want to hear if I could just pick a compliment somebody gave me? And without thought, I thought that I'm a hard-working son of a gun. I mean, I always fancied myself being a hard worker. We've heard about that this weekend. Not that I was a good father or a good husband or a good AA member or brother or anything. It was that I was a hard worker. And when I did that, I went into my Monday night men's meeting, and I said, I answered a question about myself today that if I thought the best compliment I could hear is I'm a hard-working SOB. And they all just laughed. And for the next couple of weeks, when I'd go in there, I'd say, I'm Mike, I'm alcoholic. And they'd say, yeah, and hard-working son of a gun, and laugh again. And what it did for me is I realized that once again, I think all this surrender is finding out what a higher power is not for me. And in spite of all the progress I'd made in AA for a lot of years, it was still important to me what I did for a living. That's who I thought who I was. And I don't like admitting that up here now, but I really, without really knowing that's how I was really built on the inside, because that's the only thing that had given me, I'd gotten some attention and respect from my dad if I was a hard worker and all that stuff, and I carried that workaholism with me for a long time. And so I set about, that was another surrender to me. I thought, man, you're just not getting this deal. You're not getting this. And so I set about trying to undo that. And after that, I realized that I've been given this tremendous gift, and I'm not supposed to take it out there and build my business up and make all the money I can get. If that's one thing you do, that's great. But if that's my sole purpose in life, what a shallow existence that is. And so I realized I was spending more time with that business and worshiping that business than I was my own family. And so I started taking this thing home more. And I realized that the most important thing I can be is a good husband, a father, a grandfather, a brother, a son, an AA member, and a friend. And I've learned those things, how to do that, from sober men and women in AA. I've learned a lot from my sponsors about that. And that was a real turning point for me. I had one other thing I was going to say, and I've just drawn a blank on it. So that's enough out of me. You guys get to talk longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I don't want to talk about this either. So I'm with you on that. And because I'm a firm believer, this is series of surrenders, and they're never comfortable, and it's always areas of ourself that, Tara talked about it so great last night about just those places that I'm out of road. I'm out of road, and so, but I know this isn't unique, but I'm going to try. Ooh. So, 20 years ago, so I'm 14 years sober. I was in a place of spiritual pride. I had become a worship leader in my church, and I'm 14 years sober in AA, and I'm living this double life. I'm going home to, uncomfortability. I'm going home to an abusive husband who, from the outside, is a spiritual leader in our church, and an abusive man. And I don't want to talk about that. And but what would happen is I would just keep praying for him. And what I was doing was I was giving lip service to Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd go to my little noon meeting, and if they just had the kind of God I had. And our big book talks about that our walk with God is in addition to, never instead of. And I got that flipped. And I was dying in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was extremely spiritual, prideful. And I'm going home to, terror. And, my good little AAs knew this stuff. The good ones that, you know what I mean? Because in AA we can talk about anything, right? But I'm going to my church and they're saying, keep praying for him, keep praying for him, keep praying for him. And so when this was August 8th, 2004, and I absolutely believe this. I'm a songwriter, and I had this woman tell me, I said, why did I stay so long? Why did I stay so long? And people that have never experienced that don't understand what that is. But if you have, I get you. And this woman told me, she said, it's like one more drop of water. And when we bottom out in different ways and we surrender in different ways, what happens is it just like, I believe it's like that day of surrender or the last day of the gift of desperation when we drink. It was done. And I know that there's never been a moment where I've looked back and say, oh, did I not give enough to this marriage? And what was so freaking cool was Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, I have always desperately adored and loved Alcoholics Anonymous. But that day when this came out, when I left that house in my white Jeep on my 20 acres and I drove up the road and I had my big old cell phone back then, And I call my AA girls. It was a Sunday and they were having a tea party. And I called Marlena and I just said, I'm coming out. And she goes, oh, you're coming to the tea party? And I go, I left. And she yells at me and she yells to all the women at her house, she finally left the SOB. And those women helped me clean out the checking account, got a restraining order. I hadn't smoked in 9 years, and I'm chain smoking with this lady named Eleanor, and she's like she's running the whole thing. Well, she's got to stay here, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do that. But what had happened is it was, I'm back in the steps. I'm back in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm back in the place I love, because we die of alcoholism, what was talked about last night. And through this thing, I'm having trouble in personal relationships, can't control my emotional nature. I'm like all that in stone cold sober. And then what happened through that process too is in that work, going through the work again and that spiritual pride. I remember these people invited me over to this potluck. And good old AA potluck. And they practiced a different faith than I did. I'll just say that. And I walked in the front door and I see these idols, what they worship on their fireplace, on their mantle. And, I often say this in our Southern friend, he talks about the voice of God is like a thought with a voice. And I have come to rely on that voice deep down inside every man, woman, and child, the fundamental idea of God that we can hear, and we can feel. And I walked in that front door, and I was like, oh my God, it's whatever. And God spoke to my heart in that moment. It said, I'm here. And our big book says that God is either everything or he's nothing. And I am a firm believer that God is either everywhere or he's nowhere. And I've come to find that in my life, whether it's the grocery store, put in my car, whatever it is, that God is everywhere. And in that surrender of coming back to Alcoholics Anonymous, it was not my church that saved me. It was Alcoholics Anonymous that saved me. Same thought with a voice years down the road. The church that had turned their back, and I'm not knocking church. Come on, this comes full circle, I promise you. As I'm hiding in the back of a church, I'm just, going through the motions. Okay, God, I'm here. And I drive by my old church, these people that had turned their back on me and just, they had. And I drove by the church and the thought comes to me, Marion, go in there. And then the next thought is, I can't go in there. And the next thought comes to me, you can go anywhere. And amends was made that day, and it restored my heart and my soul and faith. And really what it has to do with is that whether we're walking with God in a place with a steeple or whether we're walking with God in Alcoholics Anonymous, I've felt that faith and I've felt that power of God at my father's feet when he was dying, at a cathedral, the good old third step on your knees, or one of those things of just saying, hey, I understand. And so yeah, that's my second surrender.
I am so glad I don't have to go first. I do not think well on my feet, and I needed all that time. So I agree with the prior two speakers. I think sobriety's been a series of surrenders, right? Just some bigger, some smaller, some small epiphanies, some bigger. And, the one that I'm thinking of that probably took a really long time was finally surrendering me thinking I'm always right. So, I'm one of those people that came into Alcoholics Anonymous. I was too young, too smart, too whatever, right? And you talked about powerlessness, and I said, but I'm not, right? And you talked about God, and I said, but I know better, right? And just thinking I knew something. And I think what it ties into for me is step 2 and gaining some open-mindedness, in my life. And, one of the first things I think of when I think about giving up being right is there's this silly little saying I remember hearing early on in sobriety. And the question was, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And my answer was yes. Oh, I'm sorry, did you want me to choose? Like, no, being right makes me happy, right? And so I think it really comes with the open-mindedness to just turn it off for, maybe a half a second first and listen to what other people have to say and say, oh, that's interesting, right? And then staying. I think so much of it is just staying here and saying and listening, because in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, our book tells us we're people who would normally not mix, right? We're all shapes, sizes, and, all kinds of things, and we come together. And we don't all necessarily coming in here believing the same thing, and we don't all believe the same thing. And Alcoholics Anonymous says that's okay. And what I've learned through all of that, and for me finally saying maybe there are other ways, and doing some research and some reading and some things like that, is finding there are some really interesting ways out there. Some of them work for me, some of them don't. But when I look at all of them, I say this works for me, but that doesn't mean it's what's going to work for you. And I no longer say that what I believe is the way, right? I recently was reading Tradition 4, and there's a traditions checklist that's published by AA Grapevine, and one of the questions on the Tradition 4 checklist says, do I insist there are only a few right ways to do things in Alcoholics Anonymous? And I think to myself when I read that question, do I insist there are only a few right ways to do things? And I think to myself, if that question said, do I think there are only a few right ways? I would say maybe, right? But I no longer insist, because I know that for anything that I believe, there is somebody in the world who believes the exact opposite. And it no longer makes me right and makes them wrong. It makes us different. And what I love about Alcoholics Anonymous is that we're all different, but we found the common solution. Thank you.
Well, y'all give me too much time. All right, so we're going to go with one more question. All right, no, I'm not going to do it. I ain't going to do it. I ain't going to put y'all through that. All right, hey, let's give all three of them a great big hand. Are you? No, I'm just kidding. Y'all still got one more question. No, I'm kidding. All right. Hey, everybody remember at 2:30 we do have Teresa F. doing 6 and 7. Everybody, we haven't made this announcement, but everybody go by and check out Intergroup. I want y'all to know last year, because of the money that Intergroup raised from this conference, they didn't raise the price on big books for the whole area. So it helped the whole AA in the whole area because of that. So just remember, Intergroup does a whole lot for our area. And, so if y'all got a few dollars, go buy a book. So, all right. And we will close with the Lord's Prayer.